All right. Well, thank you so much, Ari, for having me, and thank you so much, everybody, for coming, for taking the time on this beautiful evening to talk about Ukraine. So, what I thought I would do is, kind of outline my brief remarks in the beginning by following. So these basic questions, really, that we're still trying to answer. Why did Russia reinvade Ukraine? Really, I kind of want to emphasize that this is not a new development, although it is obviously a lot more brutal. Why now? Why are we seeing this escalation? Why is it so brutal? Why has Russia resorted to these most indiscriminate and brutal tactics? What are they trying to achieve? What are some of the political objectives? What are some of the military objectives? Most importantly, to quote General Petraeus, as when he kind of considered the invasion of Iraq, tell me how this ends, right? What are some of the potential scenarios that we could be entertaining right now? How plausible are these off-ramps that everybody's been talking about? And just my general sort of the way things add up in my head. I'm an interdisciplinarian. I have been studying this region for a long time and teaching foreign policy at University of New Haven, but I'm originally from Eastern Ukraine, so a lot of my experiences are also informed by living there and having family there, and also being sort of involved with the community. But again, thank you so much for coming. I hate to have to inflict a PowerPoint presentation pain on you. I know by now we are probably all very tired. It appears that somebody just put it in comments that they can't hear anything. I just want to make sure that my sound is coming through.
It is. You are good. I will get back to them right now.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you for that. So I'll talk for about 20, 25 minutes, and then hopefully we'll have a nice discussion at the end, and we'll go from there. You might know too that I've sort of made an announcement on various social media channels that I try to avoid certain phrases and words and concepts in my analysis, mostly just to challenge myself, and I encourage you to look for them in my presentation. If you catch me saying one of these phrases or concepts, then please call me out and I will donate to a Ukrainian charity of your choice. So the concept, the terms that I try to avoid in my analysis include rules-based international order, dark versus light, moral authority, Russia's playbook, and also rebels in reference to Russia's proxy forces. So if you hear me say any of those terms, please contact me later and I will donate to a charity of your choice. But let me just get started with a quick update as to where we're at right now. As you may know, it is exactly 1 month since the reinvasion started. We are now what we have seen so far is that Russia was unable to execute their initial plan of a quick capture of the capital of Ukraine, Kyiv, and forcing the Zelensky administration to surrender. That original maximalist objective failed, as Ukrainian forces have effectively repelled attacks on multiple fronts. So you can see that there are 3 distinct fronts in the south, east, and north surrounding Kyiv. But currently, 4 months into this reinvasion, the military experts assess this situation as a stalemate and the end of the so-called end of phase 1. Now, we don't know what phase 2 will bring necessarily, but based on how indiscriminate and brutal attacks have been, particularly in Mariupol, and now we're seeing escalation in the Donbas area in the east, it is likely that phase 2 may bring even more destruction. But currently, Russian advances have stalled on all 3 fronts, including around Kyiv and in Mykolaiv, which is currently under siege. But the Russian forces seem to continue to make advances in the Donbas area with the idea of cutting off the Ukrainian army there and then focusing their efforts on surrounding Kyiv and putting more pressure on the Zelensky administration. You might know too that over the past week, I'm sure everybody has been following the news and watching these, gruesome scenes from particularly Mariupol and Kharkiv, some of the largest cities that have been destroyed. Fighting has become even more fierce in many towns and villages, and the Russian forces have made advances in the Donbas region, like I said, where they have the backing of the separatist republics there, but they're also trying to cut off the Joint Forces operation, the GFO, Ukrainian forces that had been monitoring that line of contact there since 2015. So this is just kind of where things are now. But what I wanted to address is what are some of the political objectives, right? So why this multi-vector, large-scale invasion of Ukraine, reinvasion of Ukraine, especially following the initial attack of Eastern Ukraine in 2014, and then annexation of Crimea. So what are some of the objectives being pursued here, and the historical roots of those grievances? So I want to, in my analysis, I want to kind of frame my analysis or reframe it by following Paul Danieri's excellent, brilliant book that he published in 2019 called Ukraine and Russia: From Civilized Divorce to Uncivil War, that I highly recommend. I will also make, on the request of Ari, I will make a list of readings, and both books and publications, journal articles that I will be referencing in my remarks, but also that I find particularly helpful in understanding the multidimensional nature of this war that is of global nature, really. I will, following this talk, we will be happy to make a list of readings that I have relied on. But anyway, so I think that one of the more helpful ways of looking at all the different dimensions of this war is really to look at it from three networks, or three different relationships that inform this conflict. On the one hand, it's a relationship between Ukraine and Russia in particular. On the other hand, what's at stake here is the US or the West, the proverbial West and Russia confrontation, and also various sort of differences among different domestic forces within Ukraine. Now notice, I actually adjusted the size of each balloon, of each circle, to represent the importance or the weight that each of these relationships represents now in this particular war, to where the relationships among domestic forces within Ukraine, while they were significant, I would say in 2014, 2015, they're more insignificant now. They're less and less significant as Russia's invasion actually united Ukraine, and sort of any political differences of opinion or political leanings that had existed prior to 2014, and even more so now as of last month, seem to be disappearing.
Olena, I'm sorry, excuse me. If your PowerPoint is not up.
I'm sorry?
Your PowerPoint is not up. If you're referencing slides, your screen has not been shared yet.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Let me fix that. None at all? None of them?
No, not right now.
Okay. Let me... reshare that. All right, what about now?
Yes, we're seeing it now.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks for letting me know. I had like I said, so this is the map that we missed, but it's widely available. But I'm glad that I referenced the size of those circles. I think that's what prompted perhaps you to realize that they're not being shared. So anyway, so as I was just saying, as this conflict is informed by three different relationships or networks, so to speak, dimensions of this conflict, increasingly the relationship between Russia and the West is one that is that has a greater significance in terms of what Russia is trying to achieve, and also what are some of the grievances, historical grievances that Russia has vis-a-vis the West, the collective West. And also, another dimension is the relationship between Ukraine and Russia in particular, and some of these sort of historical differences in historical representation of Ukrainian statehood and Ukraine's existence as an independent state. And then lastly, a relationship among domestic forces within Ukraine. Then, as I was just saying, without the graph in front of you, the circle that represents differences, domestic differences within Ukraine, really is becoming less and less significant as Russia's occupation actually united Ukraine and in many ways erased some of those political cleavages and differences in terms of pro-Russia, pro-West orientation. We're seeing unprecedented unity right now, where that circle, I think, is the smallest now. And this framework came from Aries' book that I will provide more information about later. So as far as, let me just unpack each of these dynamics. So as far as Russia's relationship with Ukraine, fundamentally, what's at stake here is Ukrainian statehood and particularly Russia's political elites, represented by Vladimir Putin, obviously, historical revisionism that seems to be driving this invasion in which Ukraine doesn't have a right to exist. So indulging in, what sometimes we derogatively call Putinology, where we're going to try to get into his mind and try to understand what does he really want or what does he really think. So I want to quote from the man himself. So this is an essay that Putin published last summer, in which, infamous essay in which he presented his view of the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians, and it suggested that Russians and Ukrainians were one people, a single whole, and that he has been saying that on numerous occasions. So one thing one take away from this is that Putin has been preparing for this moment for a very long time. He has long believed that Ukraine was a historical accident, a product of the Soviet Union, and it was unjustly given independence and its own sovereign territory by Vladimir Lenin as part of the Union of Socialist Republics, but it's not a state of its own. Therefore, when the Soviet Union fell apart, Ukraine should have rejoined with Russia. So that's the version of history that Vladimir Putin believes in. More importantly, I think that what also has very significant implications for the level of brutality that we're seeing right now in Russia's attack on Ukraine is that Vladimir Putin, again, I'm quoting from his essay, believes that Ukraine is a tool of rivalry between European states. So he fundamentally believes that NATO and the West, the collective West, are exploiting Ukraine to get closer to Russia, to move their military infrastructure closer to Russia's border, and to degrade and deny Russia this great power status. Again, so this is from the essay that Putin published. And then later, before the invasion on February 24th, Putin also made several public statements along the lines of, Ukraine not being grateful enough to Russia, and that Ukraine is the reason everybody in the world hates Russia, that it is all Ukraine's propaganda, Ukrainian so-called fascists that have turned the world against Russia. So obviously we all know, I'm not a historian. I trust that, everybody in this audience understands that the validity of those claims is zero, non-existent, as there are multiple historical accounts verifying the existence of the Ukrainian state and nationhood before even Russia came into being. And then I would just recommend to read Yaroslav Hrytsak and Sergei Plokhy among Ukrainian historians, and many others, Tim Snyder, who have written about the history of Ukraine, and I'll be happy to provide those resources. But more specifically, some of the objectives that Russia has set out to pursue in this new escalation have to do with the plan to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. Again, I'm quoting from Putin, as I think it's important to actually understand how they view this so that we can address it accordingly. So according to Putin, this was a special operation to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. from his words. Now, one of the things that went awfully wrong in this war is Putin's own miscalculations and his underestimation of not just Ukraine's defensive capabilities, but also of Ukraine's resilience and willingness to fight for the idea of the Ukrainian state, even among unarmed civilians. And it's one of my arguments that I have written about that I believe also led to this escalation is fundamentally war optimism. War optimism on the part of Vladimir Putin himself. I think Volodymyr Zelensky also displayed some war optimism leading up to this, when very few people in Ukraine seemed to want to believe that the troop buildup that had lasted for a year was indicative of maximalist aims and a maximalist military campaign that, as you may remember, the Ukrainian leaders tended to downplay quite a bit. Now, war optimism is fundamentally a self-deception that leads leaders to make very optimistic judgments about their chances of achieving their objectives. And one reason war optimism even becomes an issue is when leaders surround themselves with individuals who don't have incentives to report the truth, but who only have incentives to report information that is perceived to be liked by the leaders or endorsed by the leaders to maintain, and they have incentives to maintain organizational silence as opposed to engaging with the facts. Another sort of fundamental reason I think that Russia perceives Ukraine as important to its security, even though Putin has on numerous occasions framed it as NATO's enlargement and NATO moving its infrastructure to Russia's border and using Ukraine for exercises and whatnot. But I personally believe that, based on my research, that to Russia, Ukraine it's less of a security issue and more of an identity issue. And I like this framework that one of my former students, actually, Brendan Chernovsky, wrote a really good paper about that. For Russia, it's a function of ontological security. It's derived from psychological, sociological research, but has been incorporated by international relations scholars, and basically views ontological security as a mechanism by which states reinforce their particular self-identity via routinization in relation to others. So in that way, Russia considers a certain level of control over Ukraine as vital to its identity as a global power, based on how they perceive their relationship with the West. So in that way, losing Ukraine is perceived as a traumatic event that leads to this ontological insecurity. So this is just a kind of my way of saying that I think identity issues and the self-perception and self-delusion that is informing of greatness that has informed Putin's policy is what led to this escalation and culmination of this chauvinism and self-delusion, to where Putin believes that he must take Ukraine by force. So again, one of the things that I think is really hard to comprehend for people is that Putin thinks of this war as a war of necessity, whereas just about the rest of the world looks at it as a war of choice. So to address my next question is, why now? Why are we seeing this level of escalation now? So one reason why I think Putin chose to escalate things now and to reverse this sort of pro-Western orientation that he believes is really dangerous to Russia's greatness and restoration of Russia's power has to do, of course, with the events of 2014, the Maidan revolution that ousted a pro-Russia president, Yanukovych. But also it's related to the fact that the 2015 Minsk II ceasefire agreement had very slow, very little success progress in Ukraine for the last 8 years. And Putin had been getting increasingly frustrated with the lack of progress on the ceasefire agreement that would basically that would require a change in Ukraine's constitution to recognize these separatist republics as autonomous within Ukraine's sovereign borders, that would also allow Russia to use those so-called republics to leverage against Kyiv government. So Ukraine did not agree to those terms as fundamentally compromising its sovereignty. And I think that's why Putin chose to escalate things, because he just didn't see any hope to work with Zelensky on actually implementing that ceasefire agreement on Russia's terms, and because they were perceived to be irreconcilable for Ukraine. And then another trigger that led to this escalation and the troop buildup that we started seeing last spring had to do with Zelensky taking a very noticeable anti-Russia pivot in 2021, when Zelensky banned these sort of pro-Russia channels owned by Viktor Medvedchuk, one of the key opposition leaders, who is perceived to be a sort of a channel of Russia's influence in Ukraine, and also one of Putin's personal friends. So this, this sort of anti-Russia campaign and banning Russian propaganda in Ukraine, I think was the last drop for Putin, who then saw Ukraine's pro-Western orientation and pro-Western movement as irreversible. If he waited longer, I think from his point of view, if he waited longer, then it would be harder and harder to return Ukraine to Russia's orbit, as Ukraine was getting more and more anti-Russia and more pro-Western. But also, I think that part of his calculus too was, a much weaker and more fractured Western community that came in, especially coming out of the pandemic. Everybody's economies are in shambles, and domestic audiences around the world, really, particularly in Europe and in the United States, we're getting increasingly more inward-looking and opposing foreign interventions of any kind due to budgetary constraints and other considerations. So I think timing-wise, Putin probably decided that this was a better time to do it now, because if he waited, it would cost him more in the future. And then lastly, another sort of component of why Russia, the Putin decided to pull the trigger is because of the increasing U.S.-Ukraine cooperation, military assistance, joint exercises, weapon deliveries, and again, from Russia's point of view, the level of cooperation between the U.S. and Ukraine was only rising, only intensifying. Therefore, waiting could potentially lead to Ukraine acquiring even more capabilities, developing long-range missiles, drones, and so on and so forth. And that's why the time had to be done now. All right, so why I think Putin's maximalist campaign failed, and he failed to achieve his initial objectives of forcing a capitulation on Zelensky government with this sort of special operation. One was because his political aims. This was a strategic mistake, which again points to Putin not really being as much of a strategic genius as sometimes he likes to portray himself. I think he's tactically, perhaps he may be a little bit more inept than or as inept as strategically. But anyway, so what we saw in one of the miscalculations in this military campaign was a mismatch between political aims and military capabilities, with the Russian military being unprepared and unable to deliver on these maximalist aims. And that fundamentally has to do with war optimism and delusions and failures in Russia's intelligence that perhaps did not adequately inform the Russian leadership of Ukraine's military capabilities, and also of the fact that Ukraine has, since 2014, has become a much different country, where the civic identity and civic engagement have intensified to the point where they would not be able to, just walk through, or plow through Ukrainian villages and reconvert populations as they did in the Donbas to become more pro-Russian, or to embrace the Russian leadership as they did in Donbas in 2014. So this is not 2014, 2021. Ukraine is not the same country anymore. And I think it was really lost on Putin that Ukraine had undergone some tremendous transformations in terms of their civic identity. And even in Eastern Ukraine, where I come from, among Russian-speaking Ukrainians, in the last 8 years, there has been a noticeable increase in people identifying themselves as Ukrainian first, meaning not their ethnicity or heritage, but their civic identity and their willingness to fight for the Ukrainian state. So ironically, the very statehood that Putin has denied or is denying is exactly what has united Ukraine, especially in the last 8 years. He also underestimated the West's solidarity and resolve, not just in terms of the scale of sanctions that the Western community had imposed, but also tempo. As we saw both the European Union and the United States, and also other countries around, Australia, Japan, to really stepping up their sanctions on Russia and raising the cost of this invasion on Russia, and acting so in solidarity and also coordinating their sanctions. Of course, we want to see more sanctions, but I will talk more about that toward the end as we talk about some of the scenarios that could potentially be entertained. But another source of Putin's miscalculations, I think, was overestimation of his own military force. Russia has had limited successes, or had fair successes in previous campaigns, but they were much more limited in their scope, such as in Syria, Georgia, Ukraine as well in 2014. So that the much famed military modernization reform that Russia has undergone in the last decade has really created this perception, I think, not just among observers and analysts, but also in Putin's own mind. They created the perception of Russia's military to be invincible and capable of executing this large-scale operation, including potentially holding some of Ukraine's key cities and pacifying populations, which I think was just one of the major miscalculations Putin made, and assuming that they could run on Ukrainian towns and cities and expect populations to kind of embrace Russian government and to lay down arms, and for fear of being hurt or killed, eventually they would sort of come around and reconvert back to the Russian way of life, but which none of that happened. And one of the more amazing things that we have seen is not just the number of people who had joined territorial defense forces, which is a civilian unit, volunteer unit within Ukraine's armed forces, but also unarmed civilians literally blocking major highways and the entrances to the cities and villages, and creating a human wall preventing Russian armored vehicles from entering. We saw that in Melitopol. We also saw unarmed civilians in Kherson and in Kharkiv, trying to prevent Russian troops from entering. And that is the level of civilian resistance that I think Putin had underestimated. In the interest of time, I'll fast forward to some of the resolution scenarios that I think are on everybody's minds right now, as we are watching this sort of phase one slowing down a little bit, but it's the intensity and brutality is picking up, even though Russia has not made significant ground advances. The intensity of shelling and missile strikes has definitely increased. I have recently written a piece for Focus Ukraine for Wilson Center, suggesting that Russia might be scaling down its objectives while scaling up the fight. So what do I mean by that? I think, a month into this invasion, Russia seems to have revised its objectives to where their key goal remains to be demilitarization of Ukraine. However, what I think they're focusing on right now, knowing that they're not going to be able to hold terrain for a long time and pacify a population, they simply don't have the military force to maintain this level of intensity and kinetic activity in Ukraine, especially, and I think Putin probably by now realizes that capturing Kyiv is also quite ambitious, and perhaps, let alone forcing Zelensky to capitulate at this point. I think there is a zero chance that Zelensky will capitulate. So Russia has to deal with that reality, and that's why I think Putin is not irrational. I know there's a lot of conversations now assessing whether Putin is rational and whether we should be engaging with him as somebody who is a crazy maniac. I think he's a brutal dictator, but I don't think he is irrational as so much as he miscalculates based on his own delusions. But where I think the objectives are now is in demilitarizing Ukraine by physically destroying Ukraine's infrastructure and degrading Ukraine's defense industrial potential. And it's particularly evident in targeted attacks on various military bases, weapon depots, ammunition depots, as we saw, the use of hypersonic weapons in Ivano-Frankivsk, to destroy one of the weapon depots there. Then there was recently an attack on Antonov aircraft plant outside Kyiv that makes Ukraine's famous plane AN-225 that they also destroyed. So we're seeing a lot of targeted strikes on, again, military targets that really serve this aim of denying Ukraine an ability to even rebuild itself, to become and restore its military power, because I think Putin realizes at this point that they will not be able to force Zelensky to capitulate or even deny Ukraine a right to preserve its independence as a state. Some of the contributing factors to scaling down those objectives include, of course, crippling sanctions, but also ruptures within Russia's political elites, not to the extent that we probably expected or wanted to see, but nonetheless, we're seeing, first of all, a significant loss of military commanders in combat. That is also undermining Russia's military's ability to perform, well, and also purges of security services. There's there seems to be internal conflict brewing there, but the way Putin has responded to dissent and sort of internal contradictions is by introducing even more sweeping repressions, and trying kind of choking opposition, and choking media, and intensifying a repressive regime that had existed for 20 years. So some of the scenarios that I think are being discussed right now, they're not necessarily. This is not an exhaustive list, right? It's these are just some of the possibilities that we're likely to see in the near future. We don't necessarily know. The nuclear dimension to this war adds a whole another dynamic, with Russia putting its strategic nuclear weapons on high alert on day 4. Also changes the dynamics and potentially the outcome of the war, or how Russia will proceed with its conventional force augmented by the nuclear threat. But so currently, some of the possibilities here include most likely a protracted war of attrition, where Russia will be attempting to inflict more pain and more damage on Ukraine due to a lack of progress on the ground. I think these attacks are increasingly punitive, because Russia did not anticipate to have encountered such a strong resistance and defense by the Ukrainian forces. They seem to be increasingly more brutal in trying to achieve at least partial victories, from their point of view. If Zelensky makes concessions and a ceasefire can be negotiated, then these concessions most likely will include at least a sort of temporary recognition of Crimea, or these so-called republics, as Russia. And again, Zelensky has not agreed to those concessions, but it's possible that if some sort of a ceasefire, or it's not going to be a peace agreement just yet. I don't think that any peace agreement is possible for as long as Putin is in office. I think that fundamentally the Putin's regime is probably seeing, hopefully it has very little viability to it. But at this point, I think realistically, we would be, if we could negotiate a ceasefire agreement, one that could be enforced and maintained, sustained, that could be one of the ways forward. So if concessions are made, if Zelensky does make concessions, that what I think will happen is Putin will not, he will never admit that these are secondary objectives. They will present they'll declare these victories of demilitarization, denazification to the domestic audiences, and hopefully violence can be de-escalated. The war still has, potential to widen and to spill over and to involve other NATO members, which of course will add a different dynamic to this, or Putin might be replaced in a palace coup via some sort of an internal regime change, defection of political elites or military elites. So those are some of the scenarios that are being entertained. So in closing, I just wanted to show you, and I welcome your questions and your ideas as to where you see this war going and what are some of the options of conflict management are. But in closing, let me just play a really short clip for you that I think might be indicative of why, I think one of the main reasons why Putin's military campaign has failed so far. So this is as Russian troops were entering Melitopol, which is currently under Russia's control. These are Ukrainian unarmed civilians greeting Russia's so-called liberators. All right, so hopefully that a picture is worth 1,000 words. I think this is the captive audience that Putin expected. And even unarmed civilians are willing to die in front of armored vehicles, then I think it goes without saying that Ukrainian armed forces will fight until the end. And capitulation of Zelensky's regime is absolutely impossible at this point. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
We do have a couple. Thank you so much, Olena. I'll read those in a second, but I also wanted to apologize to folks. We had been granted a waiver for the meeting capacity by Zoom. That clearly did not work. So I had to panic buy an upgrade to our amount of participants. So we have been recording. If you came on late or were barred from entering in the first part of the meeting, you'll be able to watch later. But we do have a couple questions so far. The first one is, what is your sense of likelihood of a coup taking Putin out?
I'm not optimistic about it. I know that's something that would be ideal. Well, first of all, I don't think that it would necessarily lead to a change, a dramatic change in foreign policy vis-a-vis Ukraine. The historical revisionism and the view of Ukraine and its role in Russia's greatness is something that's shared by Russia's political elites, political elites are conditioned in the environment that promotes these ideas that Ukraine is a historical accident. It's a fake country that was created by Vladimir Lenin. So for the reason I'm not optimistic about any drastic changes in the view of Ukraine is exactly because it has been promoted among political elites, and a lot of people, a lot of opinion leaders actually embrace that view. So it's not just Putin who thinks that, unfortunately. Now, I do think that over time, if Russia can actually, Russians can change, but it will require a lot of effort and a lot of assistance from the U.S. in creating incentives for the Russian political elites to acknowledge, to change their foreign policy toward Ukraine and play by the rules. And again, I don't see, the other thing too, that what we know about Putin is that Putin has been coup-proofing, revolution-proofing his regime for 20 years. So Russia already has a robust security system embedded in its regime that's focused on cracking down on opposition, repressions against media, activism, foreign influences. So it already has a pretty strong internal mechanism in fighting dissent. So, there's a lot of institutional capacity there to withstand any internal turmoil that Russia is ready to squash at any moment. So, and that is why I'm not optimistic about political elites being able to overthrow Putin. However, I am optimistic about political leadership post-Putin with the right incentives, if sanctions, if we maintain strong sanctions, if Europe also can over time cut the cord and actually disconnect from Russia's energy supplies over time. I don't think it will happen anytime this year, but over time, as Europe becomes more energy independent, I think if we can maintain sanctions on Russia to where Russian political elites will have strong incentives to make concessions to lift those sanctions, that we can actually kind of recalibrate the system and create, cultivate a different political elite. But it will take, these are long-term perspectives, not short-term.
Thank you. Someone else has asked, I'm interested to learn if you have any knowledge of the Russian people are getting any accurate accounting of events in Ukraine, even though Putin has eliminated most independent media.
I don't track that particular issue very closely, but in my sort of general observations and research and conversations with people in Russia too, they know what's going on. Sometimes I think they like to pretend that they don't know. They know what's going on. We saw a massive exodus from Russia already. About what the last estimate I saw was about 500,000 people have already left. And that's because they know that the trajectory, Russia is trending very negatively and things are only going to be getting worse. They may not know the full truth, but they know what's going on. I think Russians sometimes, the political culture in Russia is such that people generally don't get involved in politics. And that's the environment in which Russians are conditioned, is that politics is dirty. Politics is where people get killed. Don't get involved. Leave it to designated people to take care of politics. So Russians in general don't pay much attention to foreign policy and criticize their government for foreign policies. So that also exacerbates this sort of response or lack of response and lack of opposition to the war in Ukraine, because it also comes from a culture that is, generally passive when it comes to engaging in political discourse in general.
Great, thank you. Another question is, how much influence does the forced famine of the 1930s have in Ukrainian attitudes about Russia? Is this forgotten history, or does it still put a cap on how much Ukrainians will ever trust Russia again?
Oh, it has tremendous impact on Ukrainian statehood and nationhood, sense of victimization is intergenerational trauma, and I think that what we're seeing right now will create intergenerational trauma that several generations beyond ours will have to unpack. The Holodomor, it was a defining moment in Ukrainian statehood and its nationhood, and its fight against Russia, because it really showed the level of atrocity, really, that the Russian government, the Soviet government at that time, inflicted on Ukrainians. It also demonstrated how much this is an existential fight. It's a fight for existential survival. So it's not about NATO. It's less about NATO or energy or any other geopolitical security concerns of balance of power or nuclear deterrence. It's those things are important, but underlying all those concerns and differences is existential survival of Ukrainians as a nation that Russia has been denying for a very long time. And I think this is what Ukrainians are trying to communicate to the world, that it has happened before, that the Ukrainians have always known that this was the Russian view of Ukraine, and they would always be trying to deny Ukraine nationhood. But Ukraine keeps coming back, it keeps bouncing back, proving only more united, only stronger and more united. So I think that the pain, the intergenerational trauma that will follow us as a result of just the last month, I don't know what's coming, will define Ukraine going forward, but will also make Ukraine stronger going forward.
Thank you so much. Speaking of going forward, next question, if you could look forward to 20 years, how would you see this situation with Russia?
Unfortunately, I think it will be a protracted war. It will be a protracted conflict. It's possible that there may be a new frozen line of contact. It could possibly even be extended beyond the current line of contact. It's possible that Russia could be pushed back if the war spills over, if NATO gets involved. Those are all contingent events that is really hard to predict right now. I think we should be ready for the, hope for the best, but get ready for the worst. 20 years from now, I think we will still see ongoing violence and ongoing kinetic activity, as I don't think that this fight is over yet, only because, like I said before, I think the political elites in Russia have been conditioned in this environment, informational environment, of thinking of Ukraine as an inferior nation, especially now when the Russians are so much more antagonized by their own failures in Ukraine, but that they express their anger by taking it out on Ukrainians again. I know that the rest of my life will be defined by this war in one way or the other. I already told my kids that they should be prepared that their lives will be defined by this war in one way or the other. So unfortunately, I don't think there will be any easy solutions, as this is an existential fight.
Next question, what is your view on Putin's claim of the genocide against the Russian people by the Ukrainian government in Donbas?
My view, I think that, that's, I don't know how valid those claims are. I'm from Donbas. If anything, I think one of the things that we saw in the last 8 years was the creation of these pro-Russia republics, was that the level of brutality that Russia's proxy forces brought in creating prison camps and torture camps in Ukraine targeted at anybody expressing Ukrainian point of view is what's where most damage comes from. That's I hate to say that's how Putin weaponizes information, because I don't like using that term. But it is fundamentally, it's a war, it's an information war as well. So, obviously Putin uses this propaganda to turn Russians against Ukrainians and turn pro-Russian, Russian-speaking Ukrainians against Ukraine. And look, they had tried that for 8 years, and somehow truth prevailed, right? The people who had remained in these Russia-controlled republics are mostly, people who didn't have a choice, who are taking care of the elderly, because it's so hard to live in those occupied territories and maintain a pro-Ukraine position. People literally get arrested and thrown and imprisoned for expressing pro-Ukraine views. So nobody who's pro-Ukraine at this point would be able to survive in these republics, or unless they're the elderly who are taking care of their families. So I think that also showed it was a pretty good demonstration as to how, no matter how much Putin might promote these ideas of genocide against Russian people and Russian-speaking people, the last 8 years showed that it just does not stick, because there's absolutely no validity to those claims. So the last 8 years was a great experiment in showing what sort of pro-Russia republics might look like in Ukraine, and also how much validity Russian propaganda has and how much buy-in it has among local populations. And the answer is not much. They're not going to be able to use that claim for much longer because it just doesn't work.
Okay, thank you. If there's a few more coming in. How much do you think Putin and other Russians have been influenced by growing up right after the siege of Leningrad, where his city, including his parents, suffered from starvation for over 2 years, losing children to starvation and suffering from widespread cannibalism during that siege? I understand his parents doted on him as a little boy, not surprising after the loss of his 2 older brothers.
Look, I don't want to psychoanalyze Putin. I'm not a clinical psychologist. I'm sorry. I don't want to do amateur psychoanalysis of an individual whom I don't know that well. Other than I think that upbringing, I'm sure, played a role. But again, it's beyond my expertise to psychoanalyze him.
Okay. So the news has been broadcasting 15,000 fatalities in the Russian army and the sinking of a large ship. How long will people sacrifice their children to this war? Was not the Afghan war the end of the last regime?
I think it's a real issue that the Russian people will have to deal with, and the Russian mothers will have to address, and the Russian society has to address, because the losses are tremendous already. I think it also shows you how little the Russian government values human life, because to them it's just not a factor. So it's not, they don't even value their lives of their own soldiers, let alone Ukrainian lives. And I think it only exposes the brutality of the Putin regime and delegitimizes his regime, hopefully in the eyes of the Russians too. That's why I don't think that there's much future left for the Putin regime, because he will not be able to no matter how many more repressions he imposes on the Russian people, I don't think that he will be able to kind of maintain legitimacy for much longer. I think the Russian society will have to deal with this, and will have to address this and unpack these issues. Ultimately, even though we understand that the Russian government is separate from the Russian people, but at the end of the day, the Russian people will also have to accept responsibility for this. And given how much they are paying in their own lives for this, I think it is now incumbent upon them to be more active in speaking up against the war, because they're losing. It's killing them even more than Putin is killing Ukrainians. So I don't know how exactly what sort of instruments of what channels of power the Russian people have, probably not many. But the truth is, this will forever change the fabric of the Russian society, they will have to engage with this reality more actively in the near future.
This next question. Hi, Olena. I missed the first 45 minutes while the room was full. Again, apologies for that. We did record. So apologies if this content has been covered, but I would love to hear your take on how this war will impact Putin's seat of power. The news can't seem to decide if he's losing it or whether he is still overwhelmingly in control.
So I wouldn't say he's losing it. I think the way the military analyst, I'm not a military analyst necessarily, but the way the military experts have presented this is that it seems as though phase one of the initial campaign is over, in where Russia it has suffered some defeats. It has failed in its maximalist campaign to have a sort of a quick run on Kyiv in a special operation, a type of a military operation. So in that way, it seems as though Russia has had to recalibrate in real time, resupply, reorganize, but we don't know what phase two will look like. So far, Ukraine has done really well, and we all know the multiple victories of the Ukrainian armed forces in destroying supply lines, and the anti-aircraft defense systems have been really effective. But I wouldn't say that I think Putin has lost strategically. The reason Putin has lost strategically is because he fundamentally could not synchronize his political aims with the military capabilities. So his political aims of decapitating Zelensky's regime were so outsized and outlandish and his military force was not prepared to deliver on that. So that's a strategic mistake that I think Putin has already, on that level, he already lost. Now, whether the war is over, unfortunately, I just didn't see the evidence of that, as we see in Mariupol alone, and outside Izum, outside Kharkiv now, is potentially the next city that may likely fall, as the intensity and brutality of missile strikes has intensified as Russia tries to inflict more pain faster to corner Zelensky and to force the sort of Russia concessions on him. So far, I would sort of discourage people from even using the binary frame of winning and losing this early in the conflict. I think Zelensky has won strategically and politically, because Ukraine, I think everybody at this point knows that Ukraine will not capitulate. So in that way, I think it's a win for Ukrainian statehood, but it's not the end of the war yet.
Olena, we are at 7 and there's around 4 or 5 more questions. So I just want to hear from you whether you're willing to continue to answer some.
Yeah, absolutely. Sure. We can take a couple more questions.
Okay, so I'm going to try to sort through ones that we haven't really touched on. Someone has asked, what is the best way for us to help out Ukraine now? Donations.
There are so many needs and so many ways to help. I would say follow your heart, and it will lead you to a way to help Ukraine that you find most compelling. There's ways to help the army. Come Back Alive is one of the organizations that actually provides for the army needs. If you want to help the children, then you can also donate that for Voices of the Children organization. So there's so many different organizations. I would say a good landing page is Razom for Ukraine. So Together for Ukraine. Let me bring up the link here. razomforukraine.org, and I'll put it in the chat here. It's an NGO volunteer organization based out here in New York, but it's a great landing page that will then introduced it to multiple other ways in which you can get involved, not necessarily monetarily, but there's ways in which you can write to your congressional representatives. You can also participate in helping refugees resettle here in the United States. We just heard today that the Biden administration just announced that they would take, I believe, 100,000 Ukrainian refugees. So there's going to be so many needs in helping these individuals with housing and various other accommodations. But I will paste a link for Razum for Ukraine organization, as they organize a lot of efforts, and they're some of the more active. The other organization is Ukrainian World Congress. I'll paste the link here too. And the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America, UCCA. There are also excellent landing pages that will then introduce you to various other ways in which you can participate. Again, if you want to help the medical needs, people on the ground, then there are local organizations that work with that. If you feel compelled by the army needs, or there's artists who are in need, children. So there's so many needs. I would say, whatever it is that you're naturally passionate about, you will find a way to connect on that level with a need in Ukraine. I'm going to paste a few links here in chat for everybody. So UCCA is the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America, that will, again, lead to more ways. They have a list of different resources that you can tap into, and I'll paste Razum for Ukraine as well. And I see there's those of you who know other organizations, feel free to share them in chat if there are any organizations that you have been working with. So those are the two that I'm more involved with or I'm familiar with. But I also know there are a lot of people on the ground. These sort of big international organizations, at this point, it's difficult for them to actually send representatives on the ground. But there's a lot of local organizations there and local individuals who are able to actually organize vehicles, medical supplies. So they're in most need right now. But start with those, and it will take you to whatever it is that compels you.
And yeah, for folks asking, I will send out follow-up resources, including the aid orgs that Olena just listed. There's still several questions, but I did have someone ask specifically. We'll close. I don't want to take up too much of your time or our audience members' time. Somebody requested a second meeting or conversation. We're definitely open to, continuing this conversation and momentum. So let me see. It was the question about Belarus. How invested, supportive, committed is Belarus's citizens and military to Russia's invasion of Ukraine?
It's a good question. Belarus, in this case, has almost zero autonomy. They're basically a force multiplier for Russia. They augment Russia's forces. They're a launching pad for Russia. They act entirely as proxies. Now, do I think they will make a difference in terms of correlation of forces? Probably not. I think that they are a resource for Russia. But I don't think that Belarusian forces will be decisive necessarily in Ukraine. But Russia is now tapping into Chechen and Syrian reserves. I think they're kind of trying to minimize their own casualties as much as possible by utilizing the help of private military contractors, professional soldiers. I think Belarus is definitely a force multiplier, but I don't think that the Belarusians, their involvement will be decisive, is the bottom line.
And there is one more question. I think it's a good one for us. Could you please comment on NATO's response and the response of Biden and European leaders to provide financial support along with some military aid to Ukraine? Are they doing enough? Could they do more without further escalating the situation?
Right. It's it's an interesting, it's a difficult question because yes and no. I think they're doing enough within the parameters established previously, but they're not doing enough in terms of deterring future Russian aggression in Ukraine. I think what NATO and the US are doing better now. They're doing deterrence better in terms of deterring Russia from invading a NATO country. And that's something that they should have done in 2014 to deter Russia from invading Ukraine too. So deterrence has failed. In the NATO deterrence has failed in that sanctions and even that level of the military assistance and weapon supplies to Ukraine sanctions were not enough to deter Russia from invading Ukraine. However, I think what the Europeans are now, the reason it's a wake up call for Europe is because I think they're now doing deterrence much better in terms of signaling to Russia what the cost is going to be if they were ever to, if the conflict was to widen beyond Ukraine's borders. So I think the level of support and NATO reinforcements, including additional troops on NATO's eastern flank, additional weapon deliveries, more advanced anti-aircraft systems delivered to Ukraine potentially very soon too. These are all effective deterrence measures that will hopefully deter Russia from actually taking the conflict to NATO territory. They will help Ukraine defend itself, in the near future, but in the long term, I don't think that will be enough from Russia completely, withdrawing from Ukraine. I think Russia will maintain its military presence in Ukraine in one way or the other, and leverage against the Ukrainian government until their economy and their military force is exhausted and depleted to where it's just not going to be feasible for them anymore. But that's a long-term perspective. In the foreseeable future, I think we're just going to be raising the cost on Russia and depleting Russia's resources to deter them from widening theater of operations. But in the short term, NATO has understandable concerns with escalating the conflict to where their direct involvement may be perceived as an escalatory measure. But there's an opinion here. Andriy Yermak, actually, Zelensky's chief of staff, recently wrote a New York Times op-ed in which he said, the NATO should enforce a no-fly zone, not only because it would help Ukraine, but because a NATO-Russia war is inevitable, and it's better to fight it alongside Ukraine. It's better to engage Russia now when Ukraine is still viable, Ukraine is still strong. So it's better to, not to delay the inevitable and engage Russia now and actually defeat Russia's military force, as opposed to waiting because, Ukraine, some people in the administration believe that a NATO-Russia war is inevitable, and it's just a matter of when we choose to actually fight it. So again, if you're going to follow that logic, if you believe that it would be better for NATO to engage Russia now and help Ukraine, then I can see how people are going to talk themselves into that. But I can also understand from NATO's point of view, why that war, that would not be, in NATO's interest right now, because it would lead to more escalation. Now, I personally believe in those of you who study political science might know of Snyder's stability and stability paradox that basically says that nuclear weapons prevent great powers from going to war with each other, but increase the likelihood of proxy wars. So unfortunately, Ukraine is now that proxy war theater of operations where great powers will, the United States and Russia will be deterred by nuclear weapons, but unfortunately, it's not going to resolve the differences between them, and that's why the fight will stay in Ukraine, and that is a very unfortunate scenario. And I hope that NATO will continue providing more advanced weapon systems to Ukraine. As Zelensky said in the last Congress address, Ukrainians they understand that it's why NATO is not why NATO is afraid to escalate this, but they're willing to fight. They just need resources to fight with, and that's at the very least that I think NATO should help Ukraine more with, because fundamentally there's a regional and world order at stake. This is not just about Ukraine. There are some much more global implications of this war, and if Ukraine is left to its own devices, then I think that the price that NATO and the United States will pay later will be much higher.
Great, thank you. I'm like blown away by everything you've shared with us tonight, and just I want to express again how grateful we are for you being here and carrying on this conversation. I want to also point out, somebody in the chat has encouraged everyone to ask your employers about matching your contributions, your aid contributions. Someone said all the above are tax deductible. I'll be sharing the list of orgs people have put in the chat when I send out a follow-up email. Lots of thank yous from people. Lots of requests for more carrying on the conversation. Is there one last thing you'd kind of like to leave us with, or something you wish more people knew or would think about the situation? Kind of open, comment from you.
Well, it's I'm sure we'll have many more of these conversations. The situation is very dynamic. One thing that I probably leave people with is usually what I tell my students too is to understand that for every action there's a reaction. So there's no preordained scenario that Russia's actions depend on how they react to our actions. So we should also assume responsibility for how we approach other countries, or how we study other countries, what we know, what we don't know, and recognize our own gaps in knowledge and understanding, because I don't believe there's Russia's playbook that sort of removes the responsibility from analyzing the dynamic events and sort of engaging in more nuanced analysis. I would sort of encourage people to study the history of not just Ukraine, but the United States. I think it also Ukraine really brings into focus this idea that democracy is not a given. I think that I'm a naturalized citizen, and to me, it has also kind of elevated the importance of protecting democracy at home, because knowing how fragile it is and that people are dying for some of the basic things in Ukraine right now, just an ability to express themselves freely. And I think it's a value that we sometimes take for granted here in the United States. So I would just encourage people to use the lessons of Ukraine, and not just to help Ukraine, but to help us here in the United States value our own democracy and protect our own democracy much more actively than I think we do sometimes.
Thank you so much. And to reiterate a comment, your students are very lucky. Thank you for this important reminder. And yes, democracy is under attack right here at home, someone reminds us. So thank you so much for your closing comments as well. And thank all of you for tuning in and asking such engaged questions and wanting to learn more. Please look out for our follow-up email. Olena is going to send some reading materials, and I'll kind of collect all the aid suggestions and send it out with this recording. So thank you.
I'm known for giving people homework, so I apologize.
No, I think that's great. That's great, right? I don't think people would come to this talk if they didn't want more to follow, So,
well, thank you so much. Thank you for providing the platform, and for giving people such wonderful service and giving them access to reading and knowledge and the world really that we can travel to without leaving our homes.
Yeah,
so
and
thank
again,
you for this.
I do want to thank the other libraries as well. I was flustered at the beginning, but it was Bill Memorial, Groton Public, Ledyard Public, New London Public, Otis, Stonington Free, and Waterford Public. So thank you all of the libraries and library staff as well for sharing the word to people and involving so many communities. Very grateful to all of you and especially to you, Olena, for being here tonight. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Okay, take care.
Bye-bye. Have a good night.
You too.